Hello photographers, today I'm going to share with you the best camera settings for concert photography. Concert photography is one of the more challenging types of photography. You've got crazy lighting, moving subjects, and then there's people everywhere. One of the best things you can do to ensure your concert photos are as awesome as you want them to be is to make sure your camera settings are optimized for concerts. The first and most important thing you need to do is get your camera ready to focus and capture the action. First, let's talk about the focus mode. There are two basic focusing methods that all cameras have. Single shot focus, which is the default focusing action, and then continuous focus. Single shot focus is where you half press the shutter button to acquire focus, and then for as long as you hold the shutter button at a half press, the focus will not change regardless of whether or not the subject moves. With single shot, if you want to readjust focus, you have to release the shutter button and then half press it again to reacquire focus. Single shot focus is not good for concert photography. So for concert photography, you want to use some form of continuous focus. Continuous focus is exactly what it sounds like. The camera, instead of locking focus on a point in space, instead looks at the subject in the scene, and as the subject moves, the camera continuously adjusts the focus to keep the subject in focus. On most modern cameras, you have a few different continuous focus options. Typically a standard continuous, a tracking continuous, and some kind of face or eye tracking continuous focus. Now, I cannot tell you which one of these to use because how well they work will vary from camera to camera. Instead, what you will need to do is test your different continuous and tracking focus modes to see which one gives you the best performance. With whatever continuous focus option you use, you still have to be sure that the camera is continuously focusing where you want it to focus, which brings us to the next setting you'll want to set, which is your focus point. This again will vary from camera to camera, but you typically have 3 focus point options to use with continuous focus. Those options are single focus points, a grouping of focus points, or the face or eye detect focus. For concert photography, I recommend a single point or a group of points, and I recommend you avoid face or eye detection. Here's why. Face or eye detection can be great, but say you're tracking the lead singer of a band, and she's moving across the stage, and as she does, she passes in front of her bass player. The camera sees the bass player's face and thinks, oh, a face, I should track that face. And in doing so, it stops focusing on the lead singer, which is the actual subject you are trying to photograph. With a single point or a group of focus points, that won't happen to you. As long as you keep your selected point or grouping of points on the subject you want in focus, that's what the camera will focus on. With your focus locked in, let's talk about the drive mode. The drive mode determines what happens when you press the shutter button, whether the camera will take the one single photo, which is the default, or whether it will take a burst of photos. For concert photography, you can go either way, and here's how I'd recommend you choose. If you are unsure of yourself and you're just getting started in shooting concerts, I'd recommend burst mode. When you're new to concert photography, you're likely going to struggle with the timing and the anticipation for the photos you're trying to take. And if you're in single shot mode, there's a good chance you're going to miss some really great photos because your timing is going to be off. Burst mode can make up for that and make it much easier for you to get the photos you want to get. If you are using burst mode, be careful. I am not recommending you go in there and machine gun your way through the concert. Once you improve your timing and anticipation, you can switch over to single shot mode. And one thing to note is that when you are using single shot mode, you can shoot much faster than you normally do with single shot focus. With continuous focus, the camera is constantly readjusting that focus, meaning it's never looking for a focus lock. So whenever you press the shutter, you'll immediately get a photo. Now, to be clear, you should not feel obligated to switch to single shot mode. If burst mode works for you, then keep on using it. Next is white balance. But before we talk about white balance, I wanted to let you know that I put all of this together into my free concert photography cheat sheet, and you can get that cheat sheet at this link right here. White balancing concert photography is particularly difficult because you are almost always shooting with non-standard, constantly changing light sources. In my opinion, the crazy lighting is part of the atmosphere of the concert, and you should lean into that for your concert photography. Trying to white balance away the red or blue or purple or whatever color lights are being used often causes more problems than it's worth. What I recommend you use is your camera's flash white balance setting, even though you're not going to be using flash. There are 2 reasons for this. First, the flash white balance is optimized for clean white light, and because it's optimized for that light, you'll actually get very accurate colors in your photos from the crazy colored concert lights. See, when you use white balance like tungsten or one of the other in-camera white balance presets, you're telling the camera to add some color to the mix in order to offset the color cast of the light. For example, tungsten and other soft white light sources are warm with an orange color cast to them. When you use the tungsten white balance setting, blue is added to the color mix of the image to offset that orange color cast. So if you use the white balance like tungsten in a concert and the concert lighting is red, the camera will add blue trying to offset for an orange color cast. That blue will mix with the red and shift the colors from red to purple. With the flash white balance setting, the camera adds no color to the mix because it's expecting light that has no color cast. So the red concert lighting will show up as true red in your photos. The other reason I recommend the flash white balance is that it's a constant white balance. The reason you want a constant white balance is to give you consistent results in your photos. The lighting at the concert will absolutely shift and change, but within the range of lighting used for the concert, it's going to be very consistent. So if you shoot a bunch of images with the red concert lighting, you want the colors to be consistent throughout all of the photos in that lighting. And a white balance that never changes is perfect for that. Now, some cameras don't let you use the flash white balance setting unless you have a flash attached to the camera. This is super stupid, but if that's the case for your camera, you have two other options. The first is to set a custom white balance color temperature. This is not available on all cameras, so you will have to check your manual. But if it is available, you'll want to set the color temperature to 5200 Kelvin. 5200 Kelvin is the color temperature for clean white light, so you'll get the same results as the flash white balance setting, you just have to set it manually. And finally, if your camera doesn't offer a custom color temperature and you can't use the flash white balance, you can use the sunlight white balance setting. Whatever you do, do not use auto white balance, as your colors will be all over the place with the camera trying to compensate for the constantly shifting lighting. Now let's talk about the metering mode. This one is easy. For concert photography, use spot metering. The constantly shifting lighting of concerts means that sometimes your subject is front lit, sometimes backlit, sometimes side lit, and the only constant is that the light is always changing. Because of this, you're going to want to be absolutely sure that you're exposing for your subject and your subject only. And to do that, make sure you're using spot metering. Spot metering uses a single focus point for metering the scene and ignores everything else in making the exposure calculation. That point is typically the center focus point, but on some cameras it can move with the focus point, so be sure to check your camera's manual. By using spot and keeping the metering point on your subject, you'll be able to respond to the lighting and keep your exposure exactly where you need it for the performer you're photographing. Now the next question is, what mode should you shoot in? You might think I'd say manual mode, but that actually depends on you. With the ever-shifting lighting of a concert, you'll need to make rapid exposure adjustments, and doing that while trying to follow a subject and anticipate the moment can be a lot to manage. If you're newer to this and still learning your camera, this is a perfect situation for you to use one of your camera's priority modes. If you're not familiar with how the priority modes work, you can learn about them in this video up here. In short, the priority modes give some exposure control back to the camera to allow it to adjust the exposure as the lighting changes. For a concert, I'd recommend using shutter priority because you're going to want to set a shutter speed that ensures you get a sharp photo of the performers as they're running around the stage. Now, as to choosing your actual settings, let's break this down as if you were shooting in manual mode, but include how you'd adapt with shutter priority. The first thing you need to do is set your aperture to the smallest aperture setting available. This will give you the largest aperture opening you can get, which will let as much light in as possible. For concert photography, we basically don't care about depth of field and only care about getting as much light as we can into the camera. Now, if you're using shutter priority mode, the camera will actually do this for you, so you don't have to worry about the aperture setting. The next setting you need to set is your shutter speed, and you need something fast enough to freeze the motion of the performance to give you a sharp photo. This will vary somewhat depending on the concert performer, but I'd recommend starting with a shutter speed around 1/250th of a second. You will have to test this to make sure you're getting sharp photos. Do not assume that 1/250th 2/50 will be fast enough. So once you have your shutter speed set, the final setting is your ISO. And here, crank it up. If shooting in manual mode, point the camera at your subject on stage and set the ISO to bring your exposure indicator to 0. If shooting in shutter priority, you actually kinda have to guess. So I'd recommend starting at ISO 3200 or 6400. Then take a test shot and see how the exposure looks. Depending on the situation, you may want to under or overexpose your photo. If you're shooting in manual and want to over or underexpose, adjust the ISO as necessary and recheck until you're happy with the exposure. And then make note of the exposure value. That exposure value is going to be your baseline as you shoot the concert. For example, let's say you're happy with the exposure value at +2/3 of a stop. As the light changes and you adjust for it, you'll want to maintain your exposure at +2/3. If you're shooting in shutter priority, you'll make your exposure adjustment using the exposure compensation function. If you're not familiar with exposure compensation or how it works, check these videos out up here. In short, when the camera has control over the exposure compensation function is a way for you to tell the camera that you want to over or underexpose the image. So when using shutter priority, once you have your shutter speed and ISO set, you take that test shot to verify your exposure. If you want to adjust the exposure, you increase the exposure compensation to overexpose the image. And if you want to underexpose the image, you decrease the exposure compensation. The nice thing about exposure compensation while shooting in a priority mode is that you don't have to worry about maintaining that as your base exposure. The camera will do it for you. However, you do still have to pay attention because if the camera is unable to adjust the settings it has control of to meet the exposure parameters you've set, your photos won't be exposed the way you want them to. When in a priority mode and the camera is unable to adjust a setting to meet the exposure requirements, the camera typically gives you some kind of a signal. Often it is the setting indicator blinking, or it may start blinking the exposure indicator, or it may just not let you take a photo. Either way, you need to keep an eye on your settings and camera to watch for this signal, and if you see it, you'll need to increase your ISO to compensate. And to be clear, you have to pay attention to this regardless of whether or not you use exposure compensation, because if the camera can't adjust for the lighting, you're going to have to respond to that, or you're going to get crappy photos. Now don't forget, I put all of this together into my free concert photography guide, and you can get that guide at this link right here. And if you have any questions about concert photography, let me know in the comments. And while you're down there, I have a question for you. What is the best concert you have ever been to? Let me know down in the comments, which is also where I'll share the best concert I've ever been to. Then don't forget to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and hit that bell icon so you don't miss any of my videos, and then get out there and take some damn photos. Thank you for watching. Now, I get loads of questions and they all boil down to one thing, which is how do I make my camera do what I want it to do? And here's the thing, your camera is like an instrument, and you can't make music if you can't play your instrument. If you want to learn how to play your camera like the instrument it is, visit this link right here to check out my Guide to Shooting in Manual Mode video course.